Peaceful transition of power, but all options are open. We want to restore Venezuelan democracy, and we believe that the Venezuelan military and its leadership have a vital role to play in this process. If you choose this path, you have the opportunity to help forge a safe and prosperous future for all of the people of Venezuela. Or you can choose the second path, continuing to support Maduro.
During his speech, Trump also claimed the twilight of socialism has arrived, not only for Venezuela, but in Cuba and Nicaragua as well.
Socialism is dying, and liberty, prosperity, and democracy are being reborn. Today our hearts are filled with hope because of the determination of millions of everyday Venezuelans, the patriotism of the Venezuelan National Assembly, and the incredible courage of interim President Juan Guaido. The people of Venezuela are standing for freedom and democracy, and the United States of America is standing right by their side.
Soon after Trump's...
Suddenly, Donald Trump woke up, and he woke up with a big love for Venezuela, and he wants to help Venezuela. When did he ever wanted to help somebody in his life? Can somebody understand? Can you really believe that he loves Venezuela? What does he love about Venezuela? The oil, the gold, diamonds, the gas. His eyes go round and big. The worst part is that people in Venezuela are puppeteers of his government that are serving the empire and take off their masks, and they call for invasions.
Editor of The Grayson, Max Blumenthal, join us from...
Is not on the Trump administration's side here, and desperation is beginning to set in Washington.
On the 19th of February 2019, the title of our episode, The Twilight of Capitalism, from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. The President, DJ Trump, made an important speech at the Florida International University on Monday. The title of his speech was, he proclaimed the twilight of socialism in the Americas during his speech, and he's talking about Venezuela, and you heard from him when we came in. The President declared 2019 as the twilight of socialism in the Western Hemisphere during his speech in Miami, and cast pending regime change in Venezuela as the harbinger of things to come in Cuba and in Nicaragua. Appearing in the capital of the Americas, Trump addressed the Venezuelan people in an effort to increase pressure on the embattled leader there, Comandante Nicolás Maduro, to flee and end the blockade of shipments of medical and food setting on the Colombian border. He spoke directly to the military leaders who continue to support Maduro, warning that the U.S. has identified their offshore holdings and is prepared to use force if necessary, in other words, an invasion. We seek a peaceful transition, but other options are on the table. He said ominously, if you choose this path, you'll find no safe harbor, no easy exit, no way out. You lose everything. His speech delivered at the Florida International University reflects the peaking of U.S. involvement in the turmoil gripping Venezuela. Once the wealthiest country in the Americas, the country is now sprawling in the thorns of hyperinflation and economic collapse. Problems exacerbated by, at the least in the short term, by an ongoing power struggle. Congress pulled economic sanctions, against the Maduro months before the national leader Juan Guaido, self-proclaimed national leader, that is, in January declared himself the Venezuelan president. In the advance of Mama Republican Marco Vegas Rubio has been ampling up the pressure. This is a very, very unusual situation. We've had various so-called banana republic coups, dictators come, dictators go, but we've not had a dictator that has declared himself a president when there's actually a president in place there, issuing a crippling sanctions. Now, this is the reason for the problems with medical supplies and various things in Venezuela. To prevent the state-owned oil company, Professor, from conducting business in with U.S. corporations except on the special conditions. Now, Citgo, that is refineries that they own. There's several of those. They have more than 6,000 workers in the U.S., and the U.S. is making those funds from Citgo available to this character Juan Guaido, using a parallel government recognition by more than 30 nations, smaller nations, in Venezuela. Before he spoke, Guaido appeared on video and spoke to the crowd of roughly 1,000. Now, these were people at the Florida International University, to a closed-off area of the Ocean Bank Arena. Relatively small crowd. Guaido's presidency is not universally recognized. This is the Miami Herald I'm reading from here. The UN and European Union continue to view Maduro as the country's president. Activists on the left have accused Trump of adopting decades of hawkish behavior in the Americas. Outside of the university arena, a crowd of several dozen protesters marched. No coup in Venezuela. This is not about democracy, no doubt about that. This is not about. This is about special interests. That is from Escobar, Maduro Escobar, 31-year-old local radio personality representing the anti-interventionist group, Hands Off Venezuela. Inside the arena, crowds chanted Libredo and roared at the prediction of Raul Castro's downfall in Venezuela and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. Trump brought some Perez here. Where'd she go? Well, anyway, he brought some Perez. I hit my marker here. Anita Perez, the mother of rebel police officer killed by the government, it claimed anyway. Throughout the afternoon, Florida's senators warned about a deadline on Friday by Guido, for Maduro to allow in the country aid. You imagine how preposterous this is? Trump suggested the U.S. might use force to push the materials through, but the national security advisor Bolton told reporters in Miami there are no plans to use a military force, but there are special forces in that area. And let's see, 180 tons. This is USAID. It's part of the CIA. They've been around a long time too. And when you get to this so-called bipartisan front here, still Democrats criticized him for doing too little to help Venezuelan exiles living in the U.S. in a conference call with reporters and Democratic members of the delegation against what Trump called extended temporary protection status of Venezuela, and accused Trump of using the suffering of Venezuelans to score points. Donna Shanela, who filed a bill anyway on Venezuela, she's been around a long time too. She was in the Clinton administration. Cast himself as a leader of the Americas before an enthusiastic crowd, no doubt about that. Home to Dora, home to thousands of Venezuelan exiles, and Sweetwater, home to thousands of Nicaraguan immigrants. He promised so-called freedom. And what's happening in Florida, basically, is, first of all, Florida is one of these states that's a criminal outfit, voter suppression there, right and left. And the idea of relying on these immigrant communities there, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, etc., and older Cubans, is part and parcel of this particular situation that DJ Trump is counting the votes early. And this is one reason our analytics arm is not counting Florida in the 2020 presidential election, because of the irregularities that have occurred in Florida until such time as the state of Florida fixes its voter suppression system. There cannot be a reliable account there. One of the things you can't do, polling can't do, models can't do. Well, models we can, and we have compensated, and in polling, using weighting, they call it weighting, you can deal with some abnormalities in voting behavior. But in a state like Florida, where we had the situation there for governor in the last race, and also in the U.S. Senate race, thousands of people were prevented from voting, were removed from the voting rolls. The Secretary of State just happened, I get DeSantis mixed up here in Georgia anyway. It was the Secretary of State was actually running for governor there. But in Florida, with DeSantis and the Republican regime there, under Scott, who actually ran for the Senate and was elected in Florida. But when you have massive voter suppression, as they did, on top of various other irregularities in Florida, such as what happened in Florida in 2000, the election was stolen from Albert Gore of Tennessee. Now, some people try to blame that on Rep. Nader. No, Rep. Nader was not the problem. There were thousands of votes that were literally just stolen. They found whole precincts of ballot boxes after the Supreme Court called the election, found there in Florida. So it's an outlaw territory. It's something you can't deal with. And you can understand why DJ Trump was at the Florida International University. When we can conclude here, you will hear from the Venezuelan response to DJ Trump, courtesy of Telesur, a network that is a joint partnership between various countries out of Quito, Ecuador. Anyway, nonetheless, the defense minister of Venezuela explained today, and I don't have that clip, but he explained today that they will secure their borders, and they've also moved to, this is also from the Miami Herald, shutting off links to some of those Caribbean, Dutch or Caribbean islands there. And let me see if I can get the names of those Dutch Caribbean islands region under an order from President Maduro, and including no, this is not it. We had the name of the islands here. Maritime borders applying there, Aruba and Carricito, and also Bahrain. So those are some of the areas they are shutting off. This Juan Guaido character claimed that he would have volunteers bringing in aid, and at the same time you have a situation there where you have concerts to be held. All this will happen this weekend. Let's see, look at my calendar here. The 22nd, Friday, Saturday, and I think 23rd, Sunday. The dueling concerts. One sponsored by Branson, the billionaire that owns Virgin Airlines, Virgin this and Virgin that. So in other words, those concerts will be there in on the border. Now, what happens on the border, we'll know next week this time, perhaps, what is going on there. Otherwise, this paper tiger will be that, just a paper tiger, trying to provoke a situation there. There is no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. What's happening there is you have a boycott that is cause these problems because they can't buy some of the medical supplies they need. They have over $1 billion in gold in the Bank of London that has been embargoed from them using economic violence. And part of the problem with this whole situation in Venezuela, that not only do you have DJ Trump rattling his reactionary saber, but in the Democratic Party there are virtually no candidates except for Bernie Sanders, who announced today that is talking about Venezuela in a positive trend. The others are going along basically to get along, or they are, as LBJ would say, as quiet as church mice. Quite literally, there. Even our friend Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has had very little to say about the situation. And the other so-called 2020 presidential candidates, they're running in the opposite direction. This is part of the problem that you had in 2016 with Hillary the Monster Clinton and the Wilsonian foreign policy, a racist foreign policy that is out there, and it manifests itself in many, many situations. It is coupled with, in the UK, with imperial or colonial, neo-colonial powers of the British government. You have the turmoil now in the Labour Party over the so-called question of Zionism, and the criticism of the Zionist state that is murdering Palestinians by the day. There's no doubt about that. These murders are taking place. In fact, in the U.S. Congress, there have been Democrats and Republicans co-sponsored legislation to prevent people from boycotting the Israeli apartheid administration. Now, we had similar situations with South Africa and their apartheid there with the corporate campaign. I remember when it started there, and against the South African, the racist regime in South Africa. So you're going to have more and more of this in the 2020 race with these various candidates. We saw that in the Women's March, labeling people that opposed the genocide in Palestine as anti-Semitic. Period. Now, that situation in American politics will have to go. And one of the things Venezuela is going to do, you see a sharpening of these anti-colonial, Zionist type movements from France. You have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests there. Gilets jaunes. Anyway, their demonstrations there highlight this whole situation. So in other words, all this is being incorporated into a national struggle. And in Venezuela, you have on the border there with Brazil and the right-wing administration that is just elected by fraud in Brazil, very right-wing situation on Vassolo there in his administration, and his inviting Israeli defense forces in there. So you have an internationalized situation. This is why Trump and the capitalist media are very upset about the situation if they can contain it. You can't contain something you're not part of. Yes, you can have economic violence, sanctions against people. You can use your military to go in literally and slaughter the people, but you don't slaughter the ideas. The Bolivarian Revolution has been there for 20 years now. And on the Comandante Hugo Chavez and his administration. But this goes back to Simon Bolivar. And that history there in that particular region. And you look at the history region, it's very, very strong. You go back hundreds of years. So it's the same thing in Cuba with Jose Marti, etc. The reactionaries themselves, and this is part of the problem also. DJ Trump was talking about some people at the Justice Department, the FBI, plotting a coup against him. So you have all these situations going on. You have in the UK the Brexit situation, the UK economy not in very good shape. Same thing in France. The demonstrations there over austerity programs, they've changed, and the Gilets jaunes have a much clearer program out there. And we did have different vests competing. I hadn't heard from those different color vests lately. They've kind of, as they say, disappeared. But this is why you have all this fractionalism, and Bernie was talking about Howard Schultz and how the corporate media is playing because he's a billionaire. And he's basically told the Democratic Party, you run a centrist candidate, I will enter the race and divide up the House and give you a Ross Perot effect in reverse. In other words, putting DJ Trump back in the White House. And so this is the situation that is now standing in this twilight of capitalism, because the problem capitalism has is in its innate inequities, and those inequities is what basically brought DJ Trump into power, where he talked about draining the swamp. Well, what the people didn't understand is when he talked about the swamp, he was draining the progressive activities and not the reactionary activities. That's why you have the EPA running roughshod over the environment. And these various other corrupt characters that is around him that are either in jail or on their way to jail. Tells you a little bit about the administration of the guy that was in charge of FEMA. Brock somebody had to resign. So you have these resignations. His designate to go to the UN withdrew from consideration there because of her criminal activity with a nanny. So in other words, all these situations are now showing up here, and you look at 2020, what they're trying to do in 2020 on the Democratic side is turn this into some sort of personality contest, because there's very little they can say. The Washington Post once wrote 16 articles in 16 articles in one day, anti-Bernie Sanders articles. But now Bernie has staked out college, free college tuition. This is at the state level. And now 20 states offer that. It used to be at the community college level, New York, California, the more progressive states offered 2 years of free, very, very low cost. It was actually free to go to any of the colleges, community colleges there, and reduce at the state college level. So we're seeing the importance of education playing in here. In Tennessee, they have a very similar rule, I believe, at the community colleges. We'll get into a little bit more of that when we have time to do that. Incidentally, in one of our programs coming up, we'll have a Playboy interview, and I've seen this before with the late actor John Wayne talking about white supremacy, etc., etc. And there's a newspaper in Mississippi, Alabama, I guess, is saying it's time to bring back the Klan to ride a roughshod over bureaucrats, I'm assuming in Washington, that would increase taxes in Alabama. So you've got all of these situations going on here. It's like the Post article saying, well, we now have these African Americans running for president. Yes, you do. You have Kamala Harris out of California, Twitter King Booker out of New Jersey. But these people represent the corporate interests. They do not represent the interests of African Americans. Period. So thus you start evaluating candidates based upon ideological situation and not some sort of personality test there. So this is going to be a different type of election, no doubt about that. Nonetheless, this has been the twilight of capitalism. We sort of reversed some things on the 19th of February 2019. So 1919 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Redneck Network. Ooh. We'll talk to you soon. Good day.
Who is he to give deadlines? So that's the first point is no one voted for him. He was a complete unknown until a couple of weeks before the U.S. decided to sort of manufacture this guy as the opposition candidate and then declare himself president. So that's the first thing. That's like me giving arbitrary deadlines to. Yeah, it's just foolish. And so what you have the situation Saturday with this sort of humanitarian aid waiting to get through. Like I kind of mentioned before briefly, it was that you're trying to sort of spark some sort of you're trying to make it's a two-pronged thing. You're trying to make the government in Venezuela look bad by not accepting it when you've been stealing billions of dollars for them over the last decade plus. So that's laughable in that sense, and if something happens violently or if there's provoked, even if it's not military or if it's people just get out of hand and something sparks, you have a reason to sort of go all in.
And it will be also interesting to analyze how the media portrays it, and the role also of social media. Will have a lot of people there with their smartphones sharing online content. So let's look at something also related to this. 3 days ago, Facebook suspended the page that belonged to alternative media outlet In the Now, reportedly at the request of CNN and think tanks which are funded by U.S. government. This page had nearly 4 million subscribers, and according to this outlet, they did not violate any Facebook rules. No warning was given, and In the Now says that Facebook has not responded. According to Rania Kalek, who works for the outlet, it is no coincidence that the government prompted CNN to suspend the account when alternative outlets are the only platforms challenging the U.S. plot on Venezuela. So this is happening in the U.S., and it's interesting to analyze that Trump mentioned that in his speech. He said that there was no freedom of speech in Venezuela, although there's a lot of media channels and social media as well.
Any attempt. I mean, every time if you're an enemy, if we don't like you there's no freedom of speech. There's no blah blah blah. And whereas so you have these situations where.
Yes.
Where you have these situations where you have even Facebook sort of censoring. So you sort of if you don't have to censor, the government doesn't have to censor when you have these giant corporations like this basically doing it for them, like censoring sort of vaguely left-wing websites because they've been trashed as sort of these Russian troll things by Democrats and both parties, sadly.
Yeah. I have to interrupt you now.
No problem.
Let's see if we have a journalist, Max Blumenthal, with his take.
In watching Trump's speech, it was like watching any old campaign address, except that Trump is introducing some new themes here, and these are themes that the GOP and Trump have been working on. Now, first of all, we have to understand the situation that the Republicans are in Florida. It's a swing state that they need to win, where younger Cuban Americans in the Miami area are increasingly trending Democrat. This was a traditional voting bloc that the GOP always depended on to win Florida. Then you have the Puerto Rican population growing rapidly in Florida. They're coming in from a commonwealth that has been basically destroyed by neoliberalism, and you have highly educated young Puerto Ricans working at Disneyland, and the population's growing. They too are Democrats. And now the GOP is increasingly leaning on the exile population of Venezuela and Nicaragua, as well as older Cubans, and pushing the regime change narrative against the troika of tyranny. And so Trump is doing this campaign rally to do two things. First of all, to stir up the new Venezuelan exile base and the other groups that are from what John Bolton calls the troika of tyranny. And number two, introducing socialism as a campaign theme to hit out at Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, as well as one of the most popular new Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and to try to link them to what he portrays as an economic crisis in Venezuela, which, you know, being here, it's actually clear it's brought on by speculation and capitalism and not socialism. And so in many ways, this is more of a campaign rally than what we saw Dick Cheney and George Bush doing when they were trying to drum up an actual war against Iraq. At the same time, it's unclear what will happen on January 23rd. Trump is putting, on February 23rd, Trump is putting his foot down here, and he's saying that the aid is going to go in. And this is connected to the media show where Senator Marco Rubio is present on the Colombian border with Venezuela at Cucuta, and anything could happen when the aid goes through. If there is a confrontation, the situation could escalate, and Trump's speech will have been, for the first time, or not for the first time, but a campaign rally that flows into another regime change war. And that is extremely dangerous, but this all relates to the internal politics of the United States, and specifically to the politics of Florida. And one final point, it will be interesting to see how the U.S. media manages to ignore the fact that Trump got on stage and praised a literal right-wing terrorist who attacked the Ministry of Interior and Justice. I'm referring to Oscar Perez, the leader of the Sword of God terrorist band, and I bet you they will ignore it. So we'll be looking for that tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Max, for your time and for your very thoughtful insight on this speech. So, Danny, as you were saying, a campaign rally that turns into a war, could that be possible?
Yeah. Okay, right. And like once again, if something happens, even if it's not, even if the military doesn't do anything, even if something happens, maybe you have pro and you have pro and opposition. You have pro government and opposition. Protests, and one of them, something gets out of hand and something gets out of hand. I mean, the U.S. is looking for any reason they can to sort of ratchet up. Like if they can get away from this soft power stuff, and by soft power, the sanctions and like all this sort of political theater. If they can actually have a reason to go in physically, they're going to take it, and this is sort of what this is. It's a pretense of hoping they can sort of stoke something, or like that's the best case scenario, right? Is something bad happens and they can intervene militarily.
What can happen then? Who can stop Trump and his campaign for a government change in Venezuela? The countries in the region?
Exactly. That's the $1 million question. Is Russia? I mean, is China? Is someone going to step in to sort of stop this from happening? Because right now it doesn't seem like that's the case. Venezuela is getting aid, obviously, from its allies. But if push comes to shove, is this going to spark some sort of international situation where Russia or whatever uses the Security Council, yada yada yada, to intervene to make sure that this doesn't escalate into a full-blown regime change? But I mean, as we said, the U.S. has a history of doing that without sort of a lot of pushback. So.
And it's interesting that Max mentioned the case of Puerto Rico. How does that fall in this line of speech of Trump? We had Marco Rubio at the rally. We had different people from several Latin American countries there that are exiled and they're living there.
Yeah, as Max pointed out, it's one side. It's one side foreign policy speech. The other side, like, this is going to be my campaign. And part of, as you mentioned, and as Max mentioned again, Florida is a swing state, and they're losing ground to Democrats in that state. So it was you're playing up. You're talking about Cuba, and you're talking about saving Latin America from tyranny or some made-up tyranny, then yeah, you're just trying to drum up support where you can, because once again, I'm going to go back to this, is that it's another distraction, because if you could scare up things about socialism, you can scare up things about, military and freedom, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to talk about that. You have a massive amount of income inequality in America. You have a healthcare system that is in shambles. U.S. pays more or spends more and has worse results than any other developed country. So you don't have to talk about those. If you can talk about, once again, going back to like the wall, you can talk about the border, you can talk about made-up socialism fear, if you can talk about all this other stuff, you don't have to talk about how you are just giving massive, massive amounts of money to the top 1% and exacerbating an already bad situation that he took from Obama.
Indeed. So, as we see, Trump's words have taken a lot of rejection from a lot of people. We have, for example, Bruno Rodriguez, a foreign minister of Cuba, saying that it's an offensive speech by the president of the U.S. in Miami, where he confirms the threat of a military aggression against Venezuela. He says it's time to speak up on top of the differences, of the political differences, to defend peace. Humanitarian aid is a pretext for a war, he says, that will take away the oil of Venezuela. This is Bruno Rodriguez speaking on behalf of the Cuban government that knows a lot about U.S. interference.
Right, yeah, right. And to say, to be surprised that Trump gave an offensive speech, I don't think he's surprised, but in everything that man says generally is has some sort of offense to it, just because that's his sort of character. Yeah, the time to speak up is long, and I mean, there's still time to speak up because nothing bad has happened. The time to speak up is, we're already down this road. We're coming up to this Saturday, blah, blah, blah. There's deadlines, and there's the possibility of confrontation. So the time to speak up was long ago. Everybody that's going to speak up now and sort of speak up for peace and take a stand now, you should have been already doing that, but your voice is still welcome.
And that's going to be specifically the case for us as well, that we're going to call for peace, for a peaceful resolution of any political difference. Thank you very much, Danny, for joining us.
Of course, anytime.
And thank you as well. If you want more information, of course, you can follow us on social media, and on our website we are at telesurenglish.net. So thank you for joining us. Until the next time.